Hello, and welcome to Fireside History. In this episode, we delve deeper into the spark that ignited a revolution. The Stamp Act had arrived, not merely as another tax, but as a direct challenge to the very idea of colonial self-governance. This was no longer about economic hardship alone. It quickly transformed into a fundamental question of rights and power. For the first time, 13 disparate colonies found a singular unifying cause against London. They declared with one voice, no taxation without representation. How did a law, intended to pay for their defense, push loyal British subjects onto the path of outright rebellion? Why did this slogan become a non-negotiable principle worth fighting for? Let's begin with today's story. That solution, which seemed so logical from 3,000 miles away in London, had a name: George Grenville. He was the Prime Minister, a man known for his incredible work ethic and his obsession with balancing the books. Grenville wasn't a villain. He was an accountant in a politician's world. He looked at the empire's sprawling finances and saw a glaring inefficiency: the American colonies. To him, the numbers told a simple story. His calculations showed that the average person in Britain was paying about 25 shillings a year in taxes. The average American colonist, barely 1 shilling. To Grenville, this wasn't just an issue of fairness. It was an accounting error that needed immediate correction. This was a massive one. He saw the colonies as prosperous children who had never been asked to pay their own way. His first move was the Sugar Act of 1764. On the surface, it actually lowered the tax on foreign molasses. But this was a clever trick. The real change was a brutal crackdown on enforcement. For decades, colonial merchants had treated smuggling as a kind of national sport, and they were very good at it. The Sugar Act was designed to end the game. For the first time, an act's stated purpose was not to regulate trade, but to raise money directly from the colonies. The colonists grumbled, of course. Smuggling was profitable, and no one enjoys paying taxes they used to avoid. But the protests were relatively scattered. There were some angry letters and fiery speeches, but nothing like the storm that was coming. They hadn't found their unified voice just yet. But Grenville knew the Sugar Act would never be enough to pay for the army stationed in America. During the debate in Parliament, he dropped a bombshell. He openly announced that another, more direct tax would probably be necessary. He even challenged the colonial agents in London. Did they have a better suggestion for raising the money? They had none. And so, the clock started ticking on a policy that would change the world forever. George Grenville wasn't just thinking about money. He was a man obsessed with procedure and principle. In his mind, the British Empire was a grand, intricate machine. The American colonies were a crucial part, but they were not running correctly. They were consuming imperial resources without contributing to the engine room. To Grenville, this was an offense against logic itself. His argument was simple, and from his perspective, irrefutable. The war had been fought for the colonies' protection. The army was stationed there for their continued safety. Therefore, they had a clear obligation to help pay for it. This wasn't a punishment. It was a simple matter of duty, the expected contribution of any British subject who enjoyed the benefits of the world's most powerful empire. When the colonists began to raise their voices against taxation, Grenville had a ready-made answer. It was a concept known as virtual representation. The idea was that Parliament didn't just represent the towns and counties that elected its members. No, each member of Parliament represented the interests of the entire British Empire. It didn't matter that no one in Boston or Philadelphia had ever voted for them. A member from Bristol, they argued, was just as concerned with the welfare of Massachusetts as he was with his own city. The colonists were British subjects, so they were virtually represented in London. You can almost hear the colonists laughing from across the Atlantic, or maybe screaming. Their entire political tradition was built on direct representation. Their local assemblies were made up of men they knew, men they elected, who answered directly to them. This London theory sounded like a convenient fantasy. It was a clever argument designed to justify taking their money while denying them a real voice. The stage was now set for a fundamental clash. It wasn't about shillings and pounds anymore. It was about two completely different definitions of freedom. The Sugar Act of 1764 felt like a betrayal. For generations, an unspoken agreement had existed across the Atlantic. London might issue trade regulations, but enforcement was often lax. Colonial merchants, in turn, built vibrant economies, often by bending those rules. This easygoing relationship allowed a degree of freedom and prosperity that Americans had come to expect. Then, George Grenville arrived, not with a tweak to trade, but with a declaration. The new act, while lowering the tax on foreign molasses, explicitly stated its goal was to raise a revenue. This seemingly small phrase was a seismic shift. Parliament was no longer just guiding commerce. It was demanding money directly from colonial pockets. This was a direct financial extraction, not a subtle trade duty. The true insult, however, lay in the legal machinery designed to enforce this new policy. Accused smugglers would bypass local juries entirely. Instead, they faced a single Crown-appointed judge in a vice-admiralty court, often far from home. Imagine being accused of a crime, with your judge receiving a bonus if you were found guilty. That was the system they faced. This was not just an inconvenience for merchants, it stripped Englishmen of a fundamental right. This denial of trial by a jury of one's peers was a clear sign. London was treating colonists not as subjects with full rights, but as a population to be managed. Yet, the protests remained contained. They were loud in New England's port cities, among those directly affected by trade. But for a farmer in the inland territories, the issue of molasses or distant courts seemed abstract. This limited colonial uproar gave London a profoundly false sense of security. Parliament concluded that Americans would complain about specific trade issues, but would never unite over them. They believed they had found a way to extract revenue without sparking widespread rebellion. They were utterly wrong. The Sugar Act was merely a dress rehearsal, setting the stage for a much larger, more unified fight over the very definition of freedom. On March 22, 1765, the Stamp Act became law, and with it, the abstract arguments about rights and representation crashed into the daily lives of every colonist. This was not a tax on a luxury good or a distant port. This was a tax on life itself. The list of items requiring an official embossed stamp was staggering. If you wanted to get married, your license needed a stamp. If you graduated from college, your diploma needed a stamp. Every will, deed, and contract had to be stamped to be legally valid. The colonists were now paying the Crown to manage their own personal affairs. But it went much further. The act targeted the flow of information and entertainment. Every newspaper had to be printed on stamped paper, making the news more expensive. Pamphlets, almanacs, even calendars required a stamp. And in a final, almost insulting touch, the government reached for the colonists' leisure time. A stamp was required for every deck of playing cards and every pair of dice. Even a simple tavern game was now a taxable event. This was a tax that followed you from the courtroom to the printing press, and from the university to the gambling table. It was inescapable. But the final twist of the knife was a small clause that caused enormous problems. The tax had to be paid in British sterling, in hard silver coin. This was a disaster. The colonies operated on a complex system of credit, barter, and their own locally printed paper money. Hard currency was incredibly scarce. So not only were the colonists being taxed without their consent, they were being asked to pay in a form of money they barely had. It was a demand designed to fail, and in doing so, to assert absolute control. The news from London arrived in Williamsburg like a slow-burning fuse. In May 1765, the members of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colony's elected assembly, gathered. They were gentlemen, planters, and lawyers. They were used to debating land grants and tobacco prices, not open defiance of the crown. Into this tense chamber stepped a new electrifying voice, Patrick Henry. He was a young lawyer from the backcountry, not part of the established coastal elite. He had only been a member of the assembly for 9 days. He wasted no time. Henry stood and proposed a series of resolutions that would rock the foundation of colonial politics. His argument was direct and powerful. Virginians were British subjects. They possessed all the rights and privileges of people born in Britain. The most fundamental of these rights was being taxed only by their own consent, given through their representatives. Therefore, he concluded, only the Virginia Assembly had the right to tax Virginians. Anyone else who claimed that power was an enemy of the colony. The debate was furious. The older, more conservative members were horrified. As Henry spoke, comparing King George III to tyrants of the past, cries of treason echoed through the hall. Unfazed, Henry reportedly shot back with a legendary line, "If this be treason, make the most of it." In a chaotic session, the assembly narrowly passed the more moderate resolutions. They rejected the most radical one. But that is not the story the rest of America heard. Colonial newspapers got their hands on the proposals. They printed all of them, including the ones that failed. They presented them as Virginia's official united stance. The effect was electric. Suddenly, scattered anger had a legal framework. Other colonial assemblies saw Virginia's bold move, or what they thought was their bold move. They were inspired. The Virginia resolves became a template for resistance, a clear and defiant no that would be copied from New England to Georgia. The widespread resignations of stamp officials across the colonies were not an accident. They were the direct result of a calculated, organized, and often terrifying campaign by groups of ordinary colonists. These were the Sons of Liberty, and their rise fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. This was no longer just about angry mobs. The Sons of Liberty became a clandestine network, a shadow government operating out of taverns and secret meeting places. From Boston's working-class docks to New York's bustling streets, artisans, merchants, and laborers formed a brotherhood. They shared a fierce determination to stop the Stamp Act, whatever the cost. Their strategy was brutal in its simplicity and effectiveness. While politicians debated legal theory, the Sons of Liberty understood power. They didn't just protest. They identified the weak points in the Crown's administration. The local men appointed to distribute the hated stamps. These officials became targets, symbols of an oppressive law, and the Sons of Liberty made their lives a living hell. They perfected the art of public spectacle, using not just effigies, but mock funerals and parades to shame and pressure. They printed broadsides and pamphlets, using powerful, easy-to-understand language to fan the flames of popular anger. This was street-level propaganda, a constant stream of messages that rallied common folk. The Sons of Liberty created a new kind of authority. When British law demanded stamps, they ensured no one would sell them, and no one would buy them. They essentially rendered the Stamp Act unenforceable through sheer collective will and organized intimidation. This demonstrated a power far beyond official colonial assemblies, a power rooted in the unified action of the people themselves. The morning after the attack on Andrew Oliver's home, Boston was unnervingly quiet. The debris had been swept away, but the air itself felt different. Royal authority in the city had been shattered in a single night of organized fury. This was a new and terrifying reality for the men tasked with governing Massachusetts. Governor Francis Bernard was a man without options. As the king's representative, he was supposed to restore order. But how? He could not call upon the militia to disperse a mob because the militia was the mob. He couldn't order the sheriff to arrest the ringleaders because the sheriff knew his own men would refuse. And besides, who were the ringleaders? The Sons of Liberty operated from the shadows. Their power felt everywhere but seen nowhere. The official government was paralyzed. Power had not just been challenged, it had been transferred. It no longer resided in the governor's mansion or the colonial assembly. It now lived under the branches of the Liberty Tree, enforced not by law, but by the credible threat of thousands of angry citizens. The events of August 14 were not just a riot. They were a practical demonstration that the state was powerless when the people decided to stop obeying. When Andrew Oliver resigned, it was not just an act of self-preservation. It was a public acknowledgement of this new reality. The crown could not protect him. The law could not protect him. The only real power in Boston that day belonged to the crowd. The news of this complete breakdown of royal control spread to other colonies even faster than the details of the riot itself. The message was not just that a stamp distributor could be intimidated. It was that the entire apparatus of British enforcement could be rendered completely useless by a determined and united populace. The lesson was learned immediately. What happened in Boston could happen anywhere. The afterglow of triumph from the Oliver affair barely lasted 2 weeks. On August 26th, the rage that had been carefully aimed and controlled suddenly broke its leash. This time, the target was Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a man who, ironically, privately opposed the Stamp Act, but was publicly seen as a symbol of royal authority. His elegant mansion, one of Boston's grandest, became the focus of an uncontrollable fury. The scene was pure chaos. Hundreds of people, fueled by liquor and deep-seated resentments, swarmed Hutchinson's home. They methodically smashed furniture, tore down walls, and even chopped down the trees in his garden. For hours, Hutchinson and his family huddled in terror at a neighbor's house, watching their life's work disintegrate. Hutchinson later wrote that he escaped with nothing but the clothes on my back. But the true devastation was not just financial. Hutchinson was a historian, a meticulous collector of documents that chronicled Massachusetts' founding. The mob scattered his entire library into the street, burning many priceless manuscripts, destroying a unique record of the colonies past forever. It was an attack on history itself. This rampage sent shivers down the spines of even fervent patriots. Men like John Adams, while opposing the Stamp Act, were horrified by this descent into anarchy. They had wanted a firm legal challenge to Parliament. They certainly had not intended to unleash a destructive mob that seemed to care little for property or order. The attack on Hutchinson's home revealed a dangerous schism within the resistance. On one side stood the intellectual elite, who sought to defend liberty through reasoned argument. On the other, a furious populace whose anger was directed not just at London, but at wealth and perceived privilege closer to home. The lines between protest and outright rebellion, between principle and personal vendetta, had blurred with terrifying speed. While delegates debated legal principles in New York, a quieter but far more potent form of resistance was taking shape in the counting houses of America's port cities. The merchants, who had initially been horrified by the mob violence, found a weapon they could wield with devastating precision: money. They decided to hit Britain where it hurt most, in its wallet. In late 1765, over 200 New York merchants signed an agreement. They pledged to stop importing all British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. Philadelphia and Boston quickly followed suit. This was not a riot. It was a coordinated economic attack. This non-importation movement was a calculated strategy to turn British manufacturers and traders into the colonists' biggest allies. The logic was simple. If American shops were empty, British factories would fall silent. This boycott was not just for the wealthy. It became a powerful tool for popular participation. Suddenly, Every consumer choice was a political act. To refuse a British-made teacup or a bolt of English cloth was to cast a vote against the Stamp Act. The resistance moved from the streets and state houses into every colonial home. This gave rise to the Homespun movement, a powerful symbol of American defiance. Women, calling themselves the Daughters of Liberty, organized spinning bees in town squares. They turned the humble act of making their own cloth into a public display of patriotism. Wearing rough, American-made homespun fabric instead of fine British textiles became a badge of honor. It was a clear, visible statement that the colonies were prepared to sacrifice comfort for liberty. London was now fighting a war on three fronts. The Sons of Liberty controlled the streets. The Stamp Act Congress had created political unity. And now, a full-scale economic blockade threatened to cripple British trade. The pressure on Parliament was becoming unbearable, and it was coming from all sides of the Atlantic. A small aside, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The colonists, with a strategic brilliance that surprised London, had opened a new front in their battle against the Stamp Act. This was not about angry crowds or formal petitions. It was an economic war waged with precision. Merchants in the key port cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia orchestrated a coordinated offensive, the Non-Importation agreements. They willingly pledged to stop buying anything from Britain until the hated tax was abolished. This was a bold move, requiring immense sacrifice from the merchants themselves, who effectively cut off their own supply lines. But they understood Britain's Achilles heel. The American colonies were not merely a distant outpost. They were the crown jewel of British trade, absorbing a massive portion of its manufactured goods. If America stopped buying, Britain's industrial heart would simply grind to a halt. The impact across the Atlantic was swift and brutal. British warehouses, once bustling hubs of global commerce, began to swell with unsold textiles, tools, and houseware. Factory owners, accustomed to constant demand, found their orders evaporating. Thousands of workers, from weavers to shipbuilders, faced sudden unemployment. This economic hemorrhage transformed abstract colonial grievances into a very tangible crisis for ordinary British families. Suddenly, a powerful new lobby emerged: the British merchants and manufacturers themselves. They stormed Parliament, not with philosophical arguments about colonial rights, but with ledgers filled with plummeting sales figures and grim predictions of mass bankruptcies. Their message was unambiguous. This tax, intended to boost royal revenue, was instead destroying Britain's economy from within. One firm, the well-known London House of Hanbury, testified that its sales had already plummeted by 50% in America. These influential businessmen, once indifferent or even hostile to colonial complaints, became the most powerful voices for repeal. They demanded that Parliament choose between maintaining an unpopular tax and saving the British economy. This direct economic pressure, hitting the very foundations of British prosperity, made it impossible for London to simply ignore the rebellious colonies any longer. The political calculation had shifted dramatically. The battle against the Stamp Act was not just fought by men in powdered wigs or angry sailors in the streets. A quieter but equally powerful front opened up in the one place Parliament could not easily control: the colonial home. The success of the economic boycott depended entirely on the daily choices made by thousands of colonial women. They were the ones who managed household budgets and decided what to buy. Suddenly, the simple act of purchasing cloth became a profound political statement. This is where the Daughters of Liberty emerged. They were not a secret society meeting in taverns. They were a grassroots movement of women who understood their economic power and were determined to use it. If merchants were refusing to import British goods, women would ensure there was no demand for them at home. They became the logistical engine of the resistance, turning every shopping list into a declaration of principles. Their most visible weapon was the spinning wheel. Women organized public spinning bees, turning a domestic chore into a powerful spectacle of defiance. They would gather in town squares or on church lawns, their wheels whirring in unison. This was not just about making thread. It was a live performance of American self-sufficiency. Each yard of homespun cloth they produced was one less yard bought from England. Wearing rough, American-made homespun fabric instead of fine British textiles became a badge of honor, a visible symbol of one's commitment to liberty. It was a way for ordinary people, far from the centers of power, to physically wear their patriotism. The Daughters of Liberty proved that a revolution didn't only need soldiers and politicians. It also needed weavers and organizers who could turn a simple boycott into a unifying cultural movement, one household at a time. November the 1st, 1765, dawned, not with the fanfare of a new law, but with the quiet hum of a monumental failure. The Stamp Act was officially in effect, yet across the American colonies, it was a law without teeth. There were no stamps to be sold, because not a single official dared to sell them. The weeks of pressure had worked. The Crown's revenue machine was meant to begin, but the colonists simply unplugged it. This wasn't just resistance. It was a complete, systematic nullification of parliamentary authority on American soil. Imagine the absurdity of it all. What happens when the law simply stops working? The courts, requiring stamped paper for every filing, found their doors closed. Legal proceedings halted. Debts could not be settled. Land titles hung in limbo, and marriages faced questions of legitimacy. The intricate gears of daily life, relying on official documentation, ground to a collective frustrating halt. Ports, vital arteries of colonial trade, also choked. Ships sat idle, unable to obtain the required stamped clearance papers to sail. Merchants, who normally thrived on the constant movement of goods, faced a stark choice: abandon their livelihood or operate outside the law. Many chose defiance. They conducted business on unstamped paper, a collective act of civil disobedience that reshaped their understanding of legality itself. This mass refusal to cooperate was more than a protest. It was a profound declaration of self-governance. It showed that if enough people refused to comply, even the most powerful empire could be rendered helpless. The Stamp Act existed only on parchment in London, a paper tiger roaring 3,000 miles away. In America, it was a practical non-entity. The colonists had not just evaded a tax. They had demonstrated a revolutionary truth. Their collective will, not Parliament's decree, was the true arbiter of law in their communities. What happened in the colonies on that day was a de facto independence, a dress rehearsal for taking power into their own hands entirely. They had won this round, but the empire would not soon forget the humiliation. The news from America had landed in London like a series of explosions. First came the riots, then the political unity, and finally, the economic blockade. Parliament found itself besieged, not by a foreign army, but by its own angry merchants. The debate that followed was not just about a tax. It was about the very nature of the British Empire. In one corner stood the hardliners, men like the Act's original architect, George Grenville. He was furious. His perfectly logical, accountant solution to the nation's debt had been met with what he saw as criminal anarchy. For him and his supporters, any repeal would be a surrender to mob rule. It would set a terrifying precedent, teaching the colonies that defiance pays. In the other corner were the pragmatists, supported by a powerful chorus of panicked businessmen. Their champion in the Commons was the great orator Edmund Burke. He argued that the right to tax was meaningless if it could not be exercised without destroying the empire's commerce. The question, he insisted, was not whether they had a right to make the colonists miserable, but whether it was in their interests to do so. Into this fevered atmosphere stepped Benjamin Franklin, called to testify in February 1766. He was a master of political theater. Dressed plainly, he played the part of the wise, reasonable American perfectly. He explained that before 1763, the colonists held the deepest respect for Parliament. But now, he warned, that affection was totally alienated. When asked if the colonists would pay a modified tax, his answer was a simple, devastating no, never. Franklin's performance was masterful. He did not threaten. He simply laid out the new reality with cold, undeniable clarity. He provided the political cover needed for a retreat. The government was trapped. The merchants were screaming for repeal. The hardliners were demanding enforcement, and the king was insisting that British authority not be weakened. A simple repeal was impossible. They needed a way to back down while pretending they had won. On March 18, 1766, the political storm finally broke. After months of furious debate, Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act. Lord Rockingham's government had successfully navigated the crisis. The news was a thunderclap of relief that echoed on both sides of the Atlantic. The merchants had won. In London, the reaction was immediate and ecstatic. The city's powerful traders, who had been staring into the abyss of bankruptcy, celebrated as if they had won a war. Ships anchored in the River Thames unfurled their flags. Their cannons, usually reserved for naval victories, fired joyous salutes that rumbled through the capital. The economic lifeline to America had been restored, and business could resume. When the news reached the colonies weeks later, the celebrations were even more wild. America erupted in a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. In Boston, bells rang from the very same church steeples that had once called the Sons of Liberty to action. Bonfires blazed in town squares, and barrels of rum were rolled out for public toasts. The long, tense standoff was over. For a moment, all the bitterness seemed to melt away. The colonists saw themselves not as rebels, but as loyal subjects whose rights had been vindicated. They believed their good king had listened to their pleas and corrected a terrible mistake made by his ministers. In New York, they even commissioned a grand statue of King George III on horseback, a symbol of their renewed affection and loyalty. The crisis had passed. The family argument was resolved. The bond between Britain and her colonies, which had been stretched to the breaking point, felt stronger than ever. It seemed that peace and harmony had returned to the empire, for good. But amid the cheering crowds and celebratory bonfires, a crucial detail was lost. The colonists were so focused on the victory they had won, they failed to read the fine print on the deal. On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, March 18, 1766, it passed another, much shorter law. This was the Declaratory Act. It was a masterpiece of political face-saving. Lord Rockingham needed to appease the hardliners who were furious about surrendering to colonial mobs. So, he gave them this. The act was a simple, brutal statement of absolute power. It declared that Parliament's authority over the American colonies was total. It asserted its right to pass laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Let's be clear about what that phrase means. In all cases whatsoever. There is no ambiguity there. It was Parliament essentially saying, we have taken this one tax away because it was inconvenient, but do not ever forget that we have the absolute right to tax you and to do anything else we want, anytime we want. It was a constitutional hammer held over the colonies' heads. In the euphoric aftermath of the repeal, most Americans paid little attention to it. It seemed like legalistic grumbling from a defeated government. It was just words on paper, while the repeal was a real, tangible victory that put money back in their pockets. They had won the battle over the stamps. What did this new declaration matter? It mattered immensely. The Declaratory Act was a time bomb, quietly planted at the heart of the British Empire. The Stamp Act crisis had started because the colonists questioned the limits of Parliament's power. In response, Parliament had now formally declared that its power had no limits at all. The central question of the conflict was not resolved. It had been amplified. The colonists celebrated the end of a fight, not realizing that their opponent had just rewritten the rules to guarantee another one. The Stamp Act crisis did more than merely cancel an unpopular tax. It inadvertently forged a new political entity, the American identity. Before 1065, if you asked a colonist who they were, they would likely say a Virginian, a Pennsylvanian, or someone from Massachusetts. They were fiercely loyal to their local assembly and often saw their fellow colonies as economic rivals, even strangers. But the shared experience of fighting the Stamp Act fundamentally changed that. This crisis became a political laboratory for unity. Disparate communities learned the immense power of collective action. It wasn't just about individual protests anymore. It was about overcoming generations of rivalry to speak with a single voice, something previously thought impossible. The mere act of delegates from 9 colonies sitting down together in New York for the Stamp Act Congress was a revolutionary moment. It taught them how to negotiate, compromise, and find common ground on issues that transcended their provincial interests. Beyond the formal meetings, practical networks of resistance sprouted like wildfire. The Sons of Liberty, initially local groups, quickly realized the need for intercolonial communication. Their clandestine lines carrying news of protests and official resignations from town to town became the nervous system of a nascent nation. This created a flow of shared information and strategy, knitting together communities from New England to the South in a way no royal decree ever could. The coordinated boycotts, driven by merchants and sustained by women, further solidified this new identity. When Boston refused British goods, it was a collective act supported by Philadelphia and New York. This economic solidarity demonstrated that their individual prosperity was intertwined. Their combined economic weight could challenge the might of the British Empire itself. Wearing homespun cloth became a uniform of shared purpose, a visible badge of a newly emerging American identity. What London saw as isolated acts of defiance, the colonists experienced as a shared awakening. They learned that a distant parliament, however powerful, could be rendered impotent by a united front at home. This realization was far more dangerous to the empire than any tax dispute. It was the birth of an US against them, where us was no longer just a colony, but an entire continent. The Stamp Act crisis became the foundational workshop for American political unity, laying down the patterns and practices for the future Continental Congress and, ultimately, independence. The repeal of the Stamp Act brought a brief, intoxicating moment of peace. Colonists celebrated what they saw as a victory for their rights as loyal British subjects. But this was a profound misunderstanding of what had actually happened. While the tax was gone, the argument that defeated it had permanently altered the colonial mind. The crisis had forced them to define the line between liberty and tyranny, and once drawn, that line could never be erased. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was no longer just about stamps. It had metastasized into a universal principle, a fundamental test for the legitimacy of any government action. It was a simple, powerful question colonists would now ask of every law London passed. Does this have our consent? If the answer was no, the law was not just unfair, it was illegitimate. This created an ideological point of no return. Before 1765, colonists had operated with a vague, inherited understanding of their rights. Now, they possessed a clear, unified, and non-negotiable political creed. They had concluded that government power was not a gift from a distant king, but a trust granted by the people themselves for the protection of their natural rights. This was a radical departure from the old world order. This idea that a government's just powers are derived from the consent of the governed became the first true cornerstone of an American identity. It was the intellectual foundation upon which everything else would be built. The fight was no longer about appealing for better treatment from a superior power. It was about asserting a co-equal right to self-determination. A decade later, when the final break came, the logic was already in place. The Declaration of Independence was not a radical new document. It was the final, eloquent expression of the conclusion an entire generation had reached during this chaotic year. The Stamp Act crisis, in the end, gave America its founding argument. The tax itself was temporary, but the idea it unleashed would build a nation. The peace that settled over the empire in 1766 was a grand illusion. While colonists raised statues to King George III, celebrating a restored friendship, they had fundamentally misread the situation. They thought they had won a debate. Parliament, on the other hand, believed it had merely made a tactical retreat while establishing its absolute authority on paper. Both sides walked away from the crisis, believing they had been victorious. That is a recipe for disaster. The Stamp Act crisis was, in effect, America's first, and most important, school for revolution. The curriculum was brutal, but the lessons were unforgettable. The colonists entered 1765 as bickering provincials and graduated a year later as a politically unified body with a clear ideology and a proven set of tactics. They had learned that mobs could paralyze royal government, that boycotts could cripple the British economy, and that a united Congress could give their resistance a powerful, legitimate voice. They had built the entire machine of rebellion. But the most dangerous lesson was philosophical. The crisis had forced them to define exactly what they believed about power and liberty. Having concluded that consent was the only basis for legitimate government, they could never go back. From this point forward, every new law from London would be measured against this simple, unbending standard. Did we consent to this? The celebration of 1766 was therefore not the end of the story. It was merely the eye of the storm. The central question of sovereignty, of who was ultimately in charge, had not been answered. It had been dangerously inflamed. London now had a law declaring its absolute power, and America had a population believing that such power was fundamentally tyrannical. Another conflict was not just possible, it was inevitable. The only question was how long the ceasefire would last before the next round of taxes, the Townshend Acts, ignited the fire once more. We hope you found this journey through the Stamp Act crisis as illuminating as we did. This pivotal moment reshaped the American identity, building the foundational principles of a new nation. If you found this historical exploration informative and engaging, please consider liking this video. Your subscription to our channel helps us continue to uncover and share these essential stories from the past. Thank you for watching and for being a part of Fireside History.